We are both BMSs, so we do know the challenges that you face in the lab with providing stock, and we're also well aware of the dynamics of the lab. And the idea today is to give you an awareness of the blood stock inventory management task, and to help you start thinking about how you might be able to make some positive changes in your hospitals. So next slide. The objectives today is that we're going to cover the blood stocks management scheme, or BSMS. We're going to have an overview of what contributes to stock holding levels. We're going to have a look at some of the data available to you and how you can use it. We're going to talk a little bit about wastage and what you can do to help with blood stocks. Next slide. Thank you. So who are the blood stocks management team? We were established about 20 years ago. The scheme collects data from hospitals to assist with maximising the efficiency of the blood supply process. And to do this, we use VANESA, which is a data management system, and that helps hospitals submit data to the scheme, and in return, they can view real-time data and charts. You might need to click through the... Do you just want to, all the slides are sort of like that, do you want to just click through and show all the points on the screen and then I'll talk? So what is it that we do? We're blood product inventory management specialists. One of our aims is to engage with hospitals to help them utilise the data that we collect to conserve blood and save time and money, and ultimately improve blood provision for patients. We also help blood services understand that hospital data, which in turn helps provide blood. We host workshops and roadshows for our participants, and that's to demonstrate some of the processes that users can benefit from. And we produce reports to help hospitals benchmark themselves. And we've also produced and are working on subsequent recommendations and guidelines for blood stocks best practices. Next slide, please. And what have we noticed through these 20 years of blood stocks management? Well, the BMS role has changed drastically. There's a lot less time for BMSs to spend on tasks such as inventory management. There is increasing pressure on specific blood products in the supply chain. So that's at the moment mainly O-neg red cells and A-neg platelets. We've noticed a variation in the quality of the data that we get submitted to VANESA, and that few hospitals are really maximising on that reporting features that are available in VANESA. And of course, we can't ignore the fact that the pandemic has brought about a lot of changes to the blood supply chain, and the BSMS scheme has been really integral to monitoring the changes, and we've been able to use a lot of the data to suggest how hospitals have been responding to the pandemic. Next slide, please. So this chart summarises the red cell issue trends, and I thought it'd be quite interesting to see how the pandemic has really affected the issues of blood stocks. We can see that the blood stock has decreased by about 17% at the sort of peak of the pandemic. O-neg decreased a lot less so, but usually we see about a 1% decline every year, and over the peak of the pandemic, this reduced by 17%. So now we're going to have a look at a few examples of, so we're going to move on now to thinking about blood stocks management, and in specific, we're going to look at red cells. So I want you to just have a quick think about what affects how much red cell stock you hold where you currently work. Is it a carefully refined balance? Is it based more on feeling? And we're going to have a look now at some examples of some blood stocks levels. So next slide, please. So all participating hospitals that supply data to VANESA also supply ideal stock levels for red cells for each blood group. And this is a summary of some of the London RTC hospitals with their ideal stock levels. And you can see some variations, and particularly here for the less frequently used blood groups, which some sites don't stock at all. And what I hope this shows you is that there's a great deal of variation in these levels. And we want to sort of understand some of the reasons why stock does vary so much. So now if you click through to the next slide, we've added on the total number of issues for 2019, and hopefully that can help you see that one of the drivers for increased stock holding is the increase of demand. So 3 of the biggest users in the region have the highest ideal stock levels. But if you look down the list, you can see some variation. And in particular, I just wanted to draw your attention to St Mary's, who's a hospital that we've worked with quite closely. You can see that's somewhat of an outlier in the amount of stock that it holds compared to those around it with the number of issues. And they've made some really positive changes to their inventory practices based on data from VANESA. So next slide, please. So what else influences the decisions about how much stock is needed on the shelves? And something that VANESA has been really useful for is to help us determine that there are a lot of influencing factors to how much stock hospitals need. We're going to share with you some of those to give you an awareness, just in case you don't encounter some of these where you already work. We know that hospitals all vary in terms of their clinical workload, so that might seem obvious, but another factor is that makeup of clinical workload. So having services such as trauma, transplant, haematology can really increase that demand. Having certain demands on a type of blood group such as O-neg, so if you were perhaps supplying the air ambulance with stock every day, then you'd need to hold more O-neg stock than perhaps another hospital around you. Having remote issue or satellite fridges also increases or decreases that demand for blood inventory. So remote issue actually conversely reduces the amount of stock you need to hold on your shelves because you're using a pool of blood rather than allocating for individual patients. Something else which can affect positively the amount of stock you need to hold is how frequently your stock arrives and how far you are from your blood supply centre, which means that you don't need to hold as much to last to your next delivery because you know that it will be there quicker or sooner. Also your on-site storage capacity. So some sites fall into the trap of having a very big fridge and wanting to fill it. Then some of the other sort of less obvious things like the staffing levels, the experience of the staff that are working, some personal preferences, and also those historical factors. And then also, why do some sites not stock certain blood groups? Well, that's usually a balance between the likelihood that it's going to get used versus the likelihood that it's going to get wasted. So next slide, please. So with that in mind, what we are encouraging is the move towards the best practice of just-in-time supply. And that is a much more efficient way of managing a product. So you only stock what you need just before it's needed. And there are a lot of successful examples of just-in-time supply chains, which include supermarkets and car manufacturers, technology companies, and fast food chains. And VANESA actually has a feature which uses evidence to show how close hospitals are to that just-in-time stocking principle. Next slide, please. So I hope some of you are familiar with this screen. This is what you see in VANESA when you are inputting blood stocks for your hospitals. And there are two data parameters here which tell you how efficient your blood stock levels are. And these are the nominal stock, which is how much stock you use every day. And then the issuable stock index, which is how many days of stock is currently being held. And these are really useful if you're wanting to monitor the effects of any stock changes that you might make. So could you just click through and get the text on this? Thank you. As an example, for this site here, they're holding 31 units of O-neg, which is just one over their ideal stock level of 30. They use about 9 units a day, and at that rate, that level of stock would last them 3.5 days. So perhaps if this site were getting a daily delivery, they could think about dropping that stock level. Next slide, please. And there are a lot of other reports in VANESA which help hospitals. There's too many to go through today, but we just wanted to give you an awareness of the fact that there's so much data in there that you can get your hands on, and it can really help hospitals understand their current inventory practice and benchmark against others. Next slide, please. So a little look at wastage now. This slide here just shows you the issues and wastage for UK hospitals since 2011. We use this data to calculate something called a WAPI, which stands for wastage as a percentage of issue. And this helps us see relatively the impact of wastage. because although we can see that issues, which is the second data column, have been decreasing over time, by looking at the WAPI, we can actually see that percentage of wastage continues to increase year on year, and ONEG wastage percentage actually has a much bigger increase. And now ONEG wastage, could you just click through to the next? Thank you. ONEG wastage is now equivalent to 32% of all red cell wastage. So 1 in 3 units that goes in the bin is ONEG. So blood services really have a big challenge to collect a lot of this valuable resource, which at the moment is ultimately being disposed of. And then that means the knock-on effect of that is that there's a lot less of this valuable product there for when there's no alternative. And something that we know from VANESA is that a big contributing factor to wastage is overstocking. And not only does that lead to a massive financial cost, but it's really inefficient in terms of time. When you think about all the work that goes into donating, collecting, processing, shipping it, putting it on your shelf, moving it around your hospital, and then the process involved in wasting it, we could do a lot more to conserve this. Next slide, please. So we're just going to have a look in a little bit more detail at some of the data for a few of the London RTC hospitals, just to give you some idea about the data that you can see and the variation in wastage. Again, activity does have an impact on wastage, but the WAPI here helps us make a better comparison, even when those absolute numbers of wastage and issues are quite different. Hospital E and Hospital F have quite similar number of issues per year, but you can see that their wastage is vastly different. And then when we get down to the lower levels of issues, we know that there are some constraints which stop wastage from becoming zero. So all this data here you can see in VANESA, but the only caveat is that it's only as good as what is supplied by hospitals. So what we're really trying to encourage is that hospitals input their data, because not only can it help themselves, but it can also help others around you, and perhaps spark up some collaboration across some similar sites. Next slide, please. So with all that in mind, we're going to share with you some practical tips of things that you can start doing today, which can really help that blood supply chain. So these are some good inventory management practice tips. So first of all, you want to use your oldest stock first. Then order only what you need to last until your next delivery. So stick to those ideal stock levels as much as possible, and think about that just-in-time supply method. And ultimately that helps leave some for others. Don't forget about your remotely held units. So having good visibility of your satellite units is really essential so that they don't get forgotten about. And if you know that that might be a particular problem in your hospital, could you maybe think about a better way of monitoring those? As we know, a large contributing factor to wastage is over-specifying those valuable products. So perhaps don't order every ONEG to be CDE neg CalNeg, because not every patient actually needs that, and you could be balancing the supply chain better and leaving it for others who actually do need it. Which brings on to the next point, is that when you do need to order something special, tell the blood service that it is for a named patient, because again, that helps balance the supply chain. We again want to encourage everyone to input data into VANESA. As I said, we know that there's a lot of variation in the quality of data that's submitted. Perhaps if you don't do it in your lab, could you maybe raise the question as to why? Is it a time problem? Perhaps your lab needs a stock management champion. Maybe you could put yourself forward for that. Have a look around VANESA and familiarise yourself with the data that's available, because it might surprise you what you can see about other hospitals. And perhaps think about identifying any trends with your hospital. And then looking forwards towards the future, if you're looking for a project for your portfolio or your MSc, you could perhaps do a quality improvement project looking at wastage or inventory control. Maybe you could do an audit into how stock's replenished, and really try and identify some variations in practice and maybe change things for the better. Could you do one more click, please? Ultimately, the goal is to develop some evidence-based practice, and the main driver for any change is that it can reduce time and cost, and VANESA really does have a great chance at demonstrating that. So in in conclusion, today we talked about the different influences on what affects the stock held, in particular red cells. And hopefully you've got an awareness of what's going on outside of your hospital. And we've shared with you how VANESA can be used to show that change is needed and that we can monitor the effects of change. We looked at the current levels of wastage and how this means that there's less available to others when they need it. We all have a responsibility to our donors to minimise wastage as much as possible. And then hopefully we've shared with you some practical tips of what you can take home and start doing today, and also some tips for the longer term for you to start thinking about how you can make a difference. So that summarises our presentation for today. So thank you very much for listening. And if you do want any more detail about the reports or data, you can get in touch with us. Thank you very much.